Okay, good morning. Thank you so much for joining us this morning. My name is Jennifer Drake. I'm a professor in the Department of Civil and Mineral Engineering, and you should be at the DesignLIFES 2020 online symposium. I'd like to begin with, this is our first week, and just to give everyone information about what the DesignLIFES network and program is about. So the Natural Sciences and Engineering Research Council of Canada's Collaborative Research and Training Experience Program, or for short, NSERC CREATE programs, support the training and mentoring of students through the development of innovative training programs that encourage collaboration and integrated approaches that address significant scientific challenges, and that facilitate the transition from student to employee. DesignLIFES, which is an abbreviation for the Design of Living Infrastructure for Ecosystem Services, is excited to be one of the new 2019 CREATE programs. Our aim is to train the next generation of engineers, landscape architects, and scientists, and imbue them with the skills, both professional and technical, that they will need to design, create, and manage living and green infrastructure in Canada and abroad. So welcome everyone to our first webinar. I would also like, before we introduce our panelists today, I would like to take just a couple of minutes to do a land acknowledgement. So the City of Toronto and the University of Toronto takes its name from an Indigenous word, Toronto, which describes where there are trees standing in water. Somewhat appropriate, I think, for the theme of our group. Where U of T is located has been the territory of the Haudenosaunee Confederacy of Six Nations, and is also territory of Treaty 13 with the Mississaugas of the Credit, who are part of the Anishinaabe Nation. So today, Toronto is still home to many Indigenous, Inuit, and Métis people. And I would like to start by thanking the peoples whose territory we are on and in, that we are able to live and thrive and talk and meet together. And lastly, I would pledge that we would take our acknowledgement and turn it into action to be partners in caring for both the land and water. So today we have a very exciting panel. Before I introduce our speakers, I would just give everyone a little information about how to engage and communicate. So you should see that there is a Q&A question bubble in your options, so you can please post questions here. You can also post an introduction of who you are and where you are, and we'll share that on the chat. As questions are published, if you see a question to a panelist or that you like, please pick a thumbs up so that we can see or moderate and choose the questions that are of most interest to our audience today. So with that, we'll move to our next slide, and I will introduce our panelists. So while I'm waiting for the slides to change, we have 5 speakers today. So I'm going to start with introducing our first one. So Nick McIntosh is a professional engineer with SCS Consulting Group. Mark, sorry Mark, I should have practiced your last name. Luckhardt is Associate Director of Infrastructure Sidewalk Labs. Arlene Throness is Urban Farm Manager for Ryerson Urban Farm. Sheila Boudreau is a landscape architect with Ryerson Urban Water, and Steve Braun is a professional engineer and co-owner of CB Shield. So for each of our panelists, if you have questions, please start bringing them in. We're going to be starting to go through those shortly, but I'd like to start with everyone. Just please give us the cold note of who you are and how you got to where you are. I think for undergraduate students and graduate students alike, one of the hardest things is trying to imagine what your career is going to look like and how you're going to get from student to senior, architect, senior engineer, owner, entrepreneurial. Imagining that future for yourself can be very hard. So in 3 minutes, who you are and how you got to where you are in your career today. And we'll start with Nick.
Well, thanks very much, Jen. Thanks for the introduction and for having me at the panel today. So, you know, my career isn't particularly long. I'm just an intermediate professional engineer for a consulting firm in Ontario. But how I got here, so I started my I guess career in the living infrastructures as a Master's of Applied Science student at the University of Toronto, studying underground stormwater detention chambers. Through that graduate studies, I managed to get a job in the consulting agency in 2015. So I began as an engineering intern, doing you know, basic design and CAD work. So things that my company works on, doing the design of stormwater management ponds, large-scale infiltration facilities, rear yard infiltration trenches, permeable pavement, bioretention, floodplain modifications, erosion and sediment control design, and the functional servicing design of grading, servicing, and stormwater management at the site plan, subdivision, and block plan scales. So that's a lot of things, but all that to say that, you know, if there's an LID out there, I have likely taken part in its design, from the preliminary stages all the way through detailed design, getting approvals from municipalities and conservation authorities. At this point in time, I'm actively managing and designing projects across the GTA in all the different stages of design. So that's my brief 3-minute overview.
Thanks, Nick. And just one thing, in case, depending on the backgrounds of people who are with us today, if you notice some of our panelists mentioning the term LID, that's definitely a North American technical jargon. So it stands for low impact development, but it's very much equivalent to other things people may be familiar with, like SUDs, WSUD, and Sponge City. So LIDs are basically, they're green infrastructure for the most part, stormwater management that is integrated throughout the community and that mimics the natural flow paths of water. So next, Mark, I'd love to hear from you and how you got to where you are today.
Good morning, everybody. Thanks, Jennifer. So my career, I entered the professional workforce in 2009, which I guess is 11 years ago, which makes me feel old when I think about that. But, you know, I have always known that I wanted to build things since I was probably 16 when I started working for a landscape company in Minnesota, where I grew up. A friend of mine started a landscaping and concrete company during college that we ran for 4 years and employed some of our friends and bought a dump truck and that sort of thing. And that got me really passionate about the hands-on work of construction. So in college, I got a bachelor's in civil engineering from the University of Minnesota and graduated in 2009, which was the belly of the recession in the US at that time. I had worked, my last year in college, I worked in an internship for a municipality, city of Golden Valley, and decided that wasn't where I wanted to start my career, but I didn't really have any better options. So I was working with a group called Engineers Without Borders, who was planning a project in Guatemala. And I decided to go down to Guatemala and volunteer for a nonprofit that was building sustainable infrastructure. So I spent the summer building small rainwater harvesting tanks and systems for rural houses in Guatemala to give them a source of water for dishwashing and other, it wasn't potable, but that was really interesting. And then ended that time building a big rainwater collection facility for a school with the Engineers Without Borders group. I came back because I had student loans that I needed to repay and had a 6-month grace period. So I decided I probably needed to start making money. And I got a job with a civil contractor in Minnesota called Ceres, who was mainly a disaster response company doing debris cleanup and that sort of stuff after hurricanes in the Gulf states. but they also had a small infrastructure construction division. So I worked as a project estimator for a while, and eventually a project manager, building levees and flood walls, and a lot of work for the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers as a contractor. And then that company started up a division in Christchurch, New Zealand after the 2011 earthquakes. So I went there for a year and a half and did high-rise demolition for a year and a half, demolished something like 27 buildings and did the designs of the structural takedowns, and ended up meeting a contact in New Zealand who gave me an offer to come work in the city of San Francisco on new master plan development projects. And I thought I was going to build roads and streets and infrastructure. And then I realized about a year in that I had made a career switch into land development and real estate. And then so I started managing master development, infrastructure design, and construction. Did that in San Francisco on some of the bigger projects like Candlestick, Hunters Point, and then eventually got connected with Sidewalk Labs, which brought me to Toronto to work on the Quayside project, which unfortunately is not moving forward, but here I am. And that's how I've ended up in Toronto today. And throughout the course, I've been focusing on different types of living infrastructure, green infrastructure, all in kind of a master plan development context.
Thank you. It's surprising actually how many professionals that I know that have their roots in landscaping work as the entry point. It's interesting. We often think, I think that's why we've made this to be such an interdisciplinary group, because really these different aspects of the profession are really so closely linked. Next, could we, Arlene?
Hello, everyone. Thank you for having me. As you heard, I manage a quarter-acre green roof at Ryerson University, where we produce food for the campus community, conduct research, and host workshops and events. So just a quick bit of background on that project. The green roof was built in 2004 and operated as a passive system for 10 years. And 30 ruderal species thrived among the daylilies that were planted there. It was converted to a farm in 2014 through an ecological technique of sheet mulching, and now produces 10,000 pounds of vegetables annually. And if you want to see pictures of that project, you can Google Ryerson Urban Farm or check out our Instagram at RU Urban Farm. And Ryerson is building a second rooftop farm on campus set to open this year, which will be the first purpose-built rooftop farm for Toronto's green roof bylaw. And while the bylaw has made Toronto and Ryerson a leader in the green roof industry, we don't often see this technology being used to produce food because it presents financial and operational challenges. So for this reason, our focus at the Urban Farm is to be a living lab where urban farmers, community members, and industry partners can engage in interdisciplinary research projects to identify and respond to challenges in rooftop farming. So how did I end up in this project? I'm going to start, I am aware of the time limit, but I am going to start all the way back in high school in the 1990s, where I was inspired by my ecology teacher to start an environment club. I've always been drawn to working with food and people, so I started working in food service when I was 17 and continued in that industry off and on into my early 30s, which is a very fun, fast-paced industry, and I gained a lot of valuable knowledge and experience there. But of course, after high school, I did start in landscaping to follow the theme, in lawn care specifically, and I also started tree planting, which I did for 6 years. I loved working outdoors and working physically, especially up north. And both of those jobs were piece work, which involved a lot of time management and teamwork. And actually several of Canada's leading urban agriculture and peri-urban agriculture experts also started out in tree planting. Curtis Stone, Madeleine Desroches, and Jean-Martin Fortier. So that's kind of an interesting theme as well. And I became interested particularly in urban agriculture during my undergraduate degree, which I started part-time at Langara in Vancouver, where I'm from. Studying Latin American history, politics, and the environment, I learned about how the industrial food system exploits land and people and is dependent on inputs of chemicals and fossil fuels. And I became particularly interested in the case study of Cuba, so I spent 5 weeks there on my bicycle visiting the Organoponicos. And I chose to finish my undergrad at Concordia because they had an old rooftop greenhouse there that was being converted to food production. So I volunteered for Sustainable Concordia throughout my degree, and when I graduated, I started my career at the greenhouse as the coordinator. And I was paid $11.50 an hour for 15 hours a week. My contract was 3 months, and my role included fundraising for my own salary after that. So I leaned in and built that project up to extend my hours and hire a team. And after a few years, I had developed my skills in project management and fundraising, but I really wanted to steer my career to specialize in growing food. So I left that project and took a paid internship at Alternatives Rooftop Garden Project in Montreal. And then I went and volunteered on a farm in upstate New York to really get more experience in growing food. And I still wanted to deepen my skills further after that. So I did a 1-year training program at Linnea Farm on Cortez Island. And that training was critical. It gave me a strong foundation in ecological farming. But after a brief interlude on a beautiful island, I was ready to get back to urban farming. So I moved to Toronto, and at 31, I was desperate to get into a full-time role. I thought that I'd made a mistake choosing urban farming and would never find job security in the field. So I got a plot at Fresh City Farms in Dansview Park. I took a business course and started an edible landscaping company, thinking I would have to create my own job in this field. But at the same time, I was hired part-time at Ryerson to support the food growing that had begun on campus there. The student-initiated garden group had secured underutilized sites across campus to convert to food production, including the green roof. So like at Concordia, I was tasked with fundraising for my own salary. Again, I leaned in, put all my effort into growing the project. Now it's a department with 4 full-time roles, 5 part-time, and our team is still growing as our operations expand. And we hope to support the creation of jobs off campus as well, as we continue to support the industry as it develops in Toronto. So I hope that I didn't speak too fast or say too much.
That's amazing. I love the contrast that you can see how different career paths can go. Sometimes it can be really twists and turns and you end up realizing you've made a redirection like Mark, and sometimes it's from a very clear vision early on, and just sticking to that vision of pursuing your passion gets you to where you are today. Next, I'd love to hear from Sheila Boudreau, who's also with Ryerson Urban Water.
Hi, great to be involved in this. I'm so excited that you're doing this. My career path is longer, so it's going to be harder to jam it into 3 minutes, and I'll do my best. So I'm a landscape architect and a registered planner. I'm also an educator at the School of Urban and Regional Planning, part-time. And I think my career started when I was a kid in the country. I lived, my grandparents and my mom was younger, and I was really free range. So my playground was our garden, our orchard, the forest, the trees played with me, the animals. I was really lucky. But my grandfather was a contractor and a bricklayer, and so I learned a lot early on about materials, and I think honoring the materials. So the other thing was programs. My parents had me in things like Girl Guides, and when I was in high school, I did a program called Junior Forest Ranger, which was through the Ministry of Natural Resources at the time. And so I was way up in Chapleau area, clearing out paths for canoes and living out on the land. So I thought I would be a biologist, and I ended up going to the University of Guelph for biology. And I felt really kind of constrained with being in labs all the time because my nature was outside, and it wasn't as exciting to me to be inside so much, test tubes and things. And I could do it. I liked chemistry, but I ended up going to McGill thinking maybe it was because I didn't leave my hometown of Guelph. And then at McGill, I realized, no, I'm just not a biologist. So I came back to Guelph and I thought about design fields because I loved being creative. And I literally stumbled into the School of Landscape Architecture and asked them, what is this? And that's how I started my path of a landscape architect. And I was really lucky because I started working part-time for the City of Waterloo Parks Department as a student, and I ended up staying there for about 4 years. And Waterloo at that time was really advancing bioengineering and creek revegetation and landscapes that included what we now call green infrastructure or low impact development. And from there, I decided I was interested in policy as a planner and the larger landscapes, because I was really frustrated as a landscape architect. I saw that you're kind of at the end of the line often, and you're stuck with the bad decisions that were made early on, or the policy that's missing. So I went back to school part-time. I did a master's in planning at University of Waterloo. My husband and I ended up moving to Toronto. My master's was on the Don River, but it was actually on the Don River community-based planning. Everyone thought I was going to be designing a sustainable community because my work was always about sustainable design and planning. But I was more intrigued with how people work together because I thought that was the bigger problem. That was where the opportunities lie, was the interdisciplinary and the multiple perspectives. So that my thesis focused on the Regeneration Council and how people planned for such a large scale the Don River. And I ended up working for a company called DTAH for quite a while, about 12 years, on green roofs, master plans for campuses, really exciting waterfront Toronto projects. And I had 3 kids, so I was part-time garden design when I was on mat leave. I would literally be pushing a stroller down the road with my drawings on the top of a double stroller and on the old-fashioned cell phones, and my neighbors thought I was insane. But I loved it because it kept my brain in the botanical names, and it gave me a break from the kids. I ended up going to the City of Toronto, working as an urban designer for 6 years, and started thinking a lot about how we were not hearing the voices of Indigenous people in green infrastructure work. And we were starting to use the term low impact development and green infrastructure about that time. So I was pulling that into my work, working with Wandering Spirit School in Toronto, co-designing approaches, and trying to find ways to open up the design process as a means of reconciliation. But also I personally have a responsibility as someone with Mi'kmaq ancestry. I felt that it was my time to be making sure that I opened up that opportunity in the work I did. And Ryerson Urban Water, I joined them when I was teaching and supporting students a lot and working with Ryerson Urban Water. And I ended up going to the Toronto Region Conservation Authority to lead their landscape architecture team. And I was there for 2 years. And that was where I started I initiated the Nikibi Dawadina Gigweg youth program, which is based on the idea of interdisciplinary mentorship opportunities for Indigenous high school youth, because it's such a growing sector and there's an opportunity that I think is not being looked into, green jobs and so on, but specifically because to Indigenous people, nature's Mother Earth, right? And that's our Earth, that's our mother. And we always talk about stormwater, but it's water. Water is the blood of Mother Earth. Like the value systems that we have in this work, I think need to shift to that in order to do the hard work, which is convincing people to do the nature-based solutions we already have designs for. And I'll stop at that.
Thank you. That's it's very, very interesting to see the ebbs and flow of a long career, as well as, you know, how big life events and how your career just doesn't stop because you reach a stage where you want to have a family. Last, I'll hear from Steve.
Well, good morning, and thanks very much. And I'll tell you what, I will give you a minute or two overview of what I've done for sure, but it'll probably take me a little longer because that's the way it goes. And literally a few of the panel were kidding me when we met earlier this week that it's going to take you a little longer. That's okay. But, you know, I wanted to start by saying it's a crucial time right now for some other important things. And I was having a bit of trouble writing about myself and bigger issues. And bigger issues of the world are so pressing right now. And I've seen a lot in 32 years since my graduation, but I haven't seen anything like this. And I know that my place of privilege, you know, has been real, and I haven't known that for long enough, but it is. And I just wanted to acknowledge that. And maybe we'll talk a bit more about that, as certainly I know this session isn't about that, but I thought it needed to be said to start. So I graduated when Brian Mulroney was Prime Minister, okay, and the first George Bush was president. So I graduated from University of Guelph with a degree in water resources engineering. My first job was at a small consulting firm right in Guelph. It lasted until the recession of 1990, which was a terrible time to be an engineer. No jobs, but with a little tenacity, a little time, I did get another job and started to learn the craft of stormwater management engineering, and a career I did for 30 years and continue to this day. Amongst all the software, the pipe design is a place I started to learn about living infrastructure. We were lucky enough during that job, I worked with almost directly with a landscape architecture firm who are right in the same building. So there's that theme again, you know. The other place I worked with infrastructure was protecting water courses, and I was quite lucky to work with fluvial geomorphologists. I took a course from Dave Roskin and Bob Newbury. Very lucky to have done that. And this really got me thinking about the river as a piece of living infrastructure itself. So while enabling the sprawl of the West GTA, I'll admit to a bit of that, I also learned about drainage, rivers and water quantity and quality, fisheries ecology a bit, water balances and budgets. Also learned how to write, and that's important. But driving to the airport every day from Guelph was tough and too hard, and I ended back at the place I was just right after school. And at this small firm, you have to be an interdisciplinarian. You must just do it. You use your best judgment and just design. And there was certainly a bit of road design and parking lot design, but the interesting work with the landscape architects and fisheries biologists and river people, arborists, were always right around the corner. In 2007, I made a huge leap, and I would recommend this to people. It's a long story, but I wasn't very impressed with some answers I was getting from a stormwater design manufacturer. So they invited me to their research lab, which was really something. And I guess I was such a pain, they decided to hire me, and I ended up being their engineering director for about 4 years. I was so lucky to work with some of the biggest stormwater researchers in North America, alongside them, and a lot of them in living infrastructure field, of course. I was doing research on keeping phosphorus out of stormwater, also fine sediment, other pollutants. I worked on my first patent with this company. This is for the jellyfish filter, if you know the device, and I was one of 4 named inventors on that. This really gave me an increased taste for entrepreneurship too, and it hasn't left me since. I did leave that firm though. I returned to some stability at a national engineering firm. I got a great offer as their head of water resources. And at that time, I also became quite involved with the Canadian Water Resources Association, and through a completely unplanned path, I'm currently their national president. So that's gone well. This has been a great side thing to do, and I would recommend it to anybody to be involved with something like CWRA. Anyway, after 4 years of managing people at this large firm, I knew it wasn't quite the right thing for me, so I up and quit my job, and that was financial madness, but I did it anyway and pursued 2 startup companies, and also started my own little one-man shop doing engineering consulting. Of those today, I still have the little firm stamping some stormwater designs. The one startup taught me very much, working with the people over at the Mars Discovery District. And I had to leave that one, but I still love the idea, and it's still ongoing. and I wish them luck. The other startup was CB Shield, and that's how I met Jen Drake. And I got to work with her graduate student, Pavneet Brar, on this newly invented device. And the research at U of T went really well. And during this time, I also met people who continue to help me to this day, including Jen Hill, another alumni there. So finally, I'm almost at the present here, and apologize for the lengthy. CB Shield has really been a fun company to grow, and the premise of it is it takes a regular street drain or catch basin and turns it into a reliable water quality device. And maybe over time it'll become more of an invention. But CB Shield is still not quite grown enough to keep the lights on at home. And I took another job, somewhat part-time at the time, but it's been full-time on and off, with a company called Matrix Solutions. And they're an environment and engineering firm. Here I work on innovative river design. I was the project manager for various watercourse crossings between Oshawa and Highway, this is for Highway 407, between Oshawa and Highway 35, 115. And that's kind of where I am today. I continue with some neat stormwater designs there, including bioswales, other low impact development approaches. And the success with CB Shield's been great, and that's me up till now.
Okay, thank you. So I think everyone can see that we have a very diverse panel here from all stages of career, as well as many different professions within the living infrastructure sector. And we're going to move now to questions that we've received from the audience. So I'd like to start I've had two questions from one of our students, Garland. We'll start first with Mark. What are some of your favorite infrastructure that you've been involved with through your work at Sidewalk Labs?
So our advanced infrastructure program focuses really on kind of 6 major areas of infrastructure: energy, water, waste, mobility and logistics, dynamic streets, and digital network infrastructure. Our focus is to leverage kind of the best-in-class technologies and operational approaches to these to increase performance standards and offer new levels of sustainability, mobility outcomes, et cetera. So I don't know that I have a favorite. Energy is always some of the most complicated and interesting and has the most moving parts, but I've also really enjoyed the water systems because it integrates solutions from stormwater, potable water, recycled water, and the water approach to master development is very siloed, where buildings have standards, districts have standards, and being able to break down those silos into a comprehensive district approach to think like a raindrop from where it hits the roof all the way down to Lake Ontario. But my favorite part of it is really trying to unlock what those performance benefits are and why people should care about them, and tying that together with the way to deliver non-standard systems that can be financed and accepted by a city and municipality. That's really the challenge we have, because most of these technologies exist and the ideas are out there, but the impediment to actually realizing them in the real world is often policy, city standards, and just a municipality's aversion to taking on higher risk. So that's what we focus on, and that's primarily what my favorite part of the job is trying to find new ways to deliver these systems.
Thanks for that. Thanks for that. So our next question is for Arlene. Throughout your career, what were some of the biggest obstacles that you've encountered in managing urban rooftop gardens?
Good question. So I guess financial sustainability has been probably the biggest challenge. We're really lucky at Ryerson because we converted a roof that was built in 2004. So the soil was already really thriving. I think talking to other rooftop farmers across North America, the biggest challenge is often the soil. In addition to financial sustainability, just getting food to grow in an engineered soil can be difficult. But because our soil was alive for 10 years before we converted it, and there was more than 30 species of weeds growing up there, when we did the sheet mulching, there was so much life, so many microbes and fungi in the soil and insects that the food really grows well. So we actually produce as much or more as a rural farm per square foot. We have the same revenue and the same yield, if not more, because we're really farming bio-intensively. So that's great, but even with that said, growing food is not, like, as a business plan, farming doesn't totally make sense because it's high risk with a low reward. Most farmers just break even. So on paper, that doesn't really look great for a startup. So there needs, a lot of people are talking about quantifying ecosystem services and looking beyond what farms can offer beyond food, not just rooftop farms, but also rural farms, because agriculture is said to have the biggest potential for carbon sequestration of any other solution identified to date. So regenerative agriculture reduces emissions, but also acts as a carbon sink. It catches carbon when we stop tilling the soil, and allowing some more biodiversity in farms. So people are saying by de-intensifying farms and focusing less on production and outputs of food, we can actually increase, you know, the other outputs. Anyways, I'm just rambling, but I guess to say, finding creative ways to generate revenue. And because we're at a university, we're so lucky the university does see the value of having a rooftop farm. So they're supporting the project financially, but outside of a university setting, that's one of the reasons we don't see a lot of rooftop farms, because finding a way to make it financially sustainable can be a challenge. And then also we're building new farms, so we've got to figure out that soil blend issue, because we can't just use 10-year-old beautiful soil. So we're going to have to find an engineered soil that can work from the start. So that's one of the things our Living Lab is going to focus on.
Thanks for that. I know many of our students in this group have research that is definitely tied to engineered soil products. So I think it's probably very exciting for you to realize that there actually is an industrial problem here, that their research work and their work, during their time in school may actually help address. So we've got a popular question here from Sylvie. She's posed it to a couple of the panelists, but maybe we'll start with Nick. Graduate school teaches a variety of skills that the professional world does not. Which of these skills do you think are the most valuable and the most transferable to the professional world?
Yeah, so it's an interesting question. Obviously, graduate school it's a very varied experience depending on what you're studying and who you're working with. I think the most valuable skills are the ones that you develop on your own through your graduate study, whatever you happen to be studying. In my experience, I learned visual basic coding in Excel. I conducted a monitoring program and analyzed seasonal data, and I became familiar with the advantages and disadvantages of an emerging technology in the industry. So each of those skills have allowed me to excel in the professional world by having specialized knowledge that my team didn't have, and that I was able to refine through my graduate studies. So now, even after just a year of working at my consulting firm, I was placed in charge of their field monitoring programs and data analysis, simply because I was available and had those skills. So really, it's about highlighting that you have those specialized skills and that you've developed them to a level that they can be used professionally. I think you need to make your potential employers aware of them.
Oh, that's a great answer. I'd also be curious to hear perhaps Sheila, from your perspective, because you also did graduate work, but at a different time, and you're further along or further separated. So yeah, from your perspective, what skills do you think are most valuable and transferable that you developed during your time as a graduate student?
So I work often with grad students and they're in the planning school, and I'm trying to think about, like, in engineering, is grad school different? So I think it does probably depend when you get to the more detailed information, for sure. But I think when I was in school, I remember being taught that you're here to learn how to do research. You're here to learn how to formulate good questions and figure out a path on how to answer those. And when I work with my students, we work in a really hands-on experiential way. So I like them to take that step back and basically, what is the point? What are you doing? What is the point? Why are you here? With that problem you want to answer. And then going deep like a journalist, asking questions, figuring out what information you have, what you don't have, where can you get it? Who do you talk to? How do you listen? How, you know, those kinds of social or softer skills are so important as well, because a lot of information we need to do our work is not written down. So it's really about that in thinking, and then knowledge transfer. How do you take that, work on the problem, and share it in a way that is digestible and communicated well with whoever you're doing this work for. I think graduate school should prepare everybody to do those things.
Thank you. So our next question comes from Rashad, and this is for Stephen. I think, you know, under the theme of the social justice issues that you sort of highlighted in your introduction, do you think you could speak about your perspective of how engineers, architects, you know, other professionals or in the living infrastructure sector can be leaders in addressing social and environmental injustice?
Yeah, thanks for that question. Of course, I think we're obligated to all be leaders the best we can be. I can't say that I've taken it upon myself, and I don't know if that's the right thing to do or not, but I certainly have tried to be a mentor to grad students, and through my CWRA work to, you know, people who are not like me, right? People who are maybe not from Canada, the firstborn immigrants, or from another land, and I feel obligated to reach out, and I still keep in touch with a whole bunch of people, just to make sure you know, things are going okay in their lives, to give them something, someone to talk to, and someone to bounce ideas off of. So, you know, I haven't done anything more formal than that. I think in terms of wondering how I think engineers can be leaders in addressing social and environmental justice, yeah, let's just be open to it and be aware of it. I think more than anything, I don't claim to know more than that. And if that's, sorry to be a disappointing answer, but I do think that we're obligated as individuals to make sure we're reaching out and responding to others. So that's kind of my answer there.
Thank you. Sheila, would you like to speak to this question too? I know that you've done a lot of work, as you highlighted in your introduction as well. How can, from your perspective, how can architects, planners, engineers be leaders who are addressing social and environmental justice?
It's such a, I mean, it's such a hot topic right now, but it should always have been a hot topic. So I think as professionals, you need to take responsibility and look around you and look at your disciplines and your colleagues. And if you don't see diversity and you don't see the voices of different perspectives, then there's a problem. And then I think you have to think about, how can you make a difference? Who can you talk to? Who can you put on panels, and who can you make opportunities for, and how can you step aside just so their voice is heard? And I think that we get so busy in our own lives, and I mean, I have 3 kids. It's been a busy life, keeping a career going, but you know, we're all human, and we all have those times where you can make a difference. And the other thing you can do is speak up. I mean, I've been in meetings where I think people are afraid to step outside of what their box is. And that's why these things don't change, right? I talk to my students about being, you know, having the courage to speak up when something's not right. And, you know, it's being human that we need to be finding those ways. I don't know if that's the answer you were hoping for, but, you know, if we don't, and you're at a table and you're at a table with decision makers and you don't speak up, who will, right?
Yeah, I think it's true, and I think this speaks. It's a challenging topic, and there isn't a simple answer. So, Mark, I think you would also like to speak to this question.
Yeah. First of all, I'd like to thank Steve for just acknowledging privilege and the fact that you know, we all have had the opportunity to go to school and study things that we're interested in, and just acknowledging that place of privilege, I think, is super important at this time. And Rashad, thank you for your question, for going deeper. I'm glad that this topic or this conversation is open to those types of topics. And you know, what I would say is that it's such a complex issue. There's so many different ways to approach this and get involved and participate in the conversations that are going on, sparked by recent events in Minneapolis, my hometown, and just the history of all of these types of issues in North America, Canada too. You know, one thing I would say is that there are a lot of, not a lot, there are a few groups that are starting to tie green infrastructure to inclusive development principles. Eco districts out of Portland is a really progressive group of thinkers who have been involved around sustainable communities and have recently, I attended their conference in Pittsburgh last year, and they're focused on inclusive development and starting to bridge that conversation between how sustainable infrastructure ties to those principles is super interesting. It's not always intuitive. There's a lot more in the vertical building, affordable housing type realm of development where those conversations are clear, but you do start seeing those links, and there are resources. You know, one of the stormwater design manuals I was looking at is Denver's approach to green infrastructure implementation, and they actually in that document make the tie to inclusive development and the benefits that a living green public realm and street can have, ecological benefits that add to, you know, biophilic and general well-being and health, and those types of things are very direct ways to focus on how this type of work can tie back to some of those larger issues. So thanks for the opportunity to address that.
Thanks. So for the next question, I'm going to try and paraphrase this one coming from Jad. I think, you know, a lot of the time graduate students, you know, they realize they do a project while they're in school, but really the purpose is academic. It's about publishing papers, sometimes just for the sake of publishing papers, or writing a thesis that then sits on a shelf and really doesn't ever get translated into uptake that is real and meaningful, whether it be through communities or through industry. And so I think from the panelists here, what are some of the big knowledge gaps that you see in the living infrastructure areas where there really is a need for research and work that will actually be rapidly uptaked by the industry? Maybe we'll start with Arlene, since you kind of already, you know, touched on this theme in your introduction.
Sorry, Jen, can you just repeat in brief the question again?
Yeah, what are the main knowledge gaps that you see in the living infrastructure sector? You know, questions or problems that really need to be addressed through research?
Well, I'm so glad you asked, because our Living Lab has been trying to synthesize this. We hosted a roundtable earlier in the year to try to get as many people involved to across industries and disciplines to start to answer these questions. And we were going to host another one, which we'll have to postpone for now, but hopefully, you know, we can promote it through this channel as well to get more people involved. But yeah, some of the themes that came up from that were design, like, you know, for rooftop farming specifically, designing tools and infrastructure specific for rooftop farms, access and inclusion, incorporating Indigenous wisdom, because there's a lot there that can be applied to ecosystem services and green infrastructure and rooftop farming. So we're starting a project on campus for that. Knowledge mobilization and translation, which was already brought up, was a theme. System integration, how, you know, so we look at how we design rooftop farms, but how do they integrate into the surrounding neighborhood and food system. Yeah, I think that's as much as I can think of off the top of my head there.
Thanks. How about Nick? What's your thoughts on terms of knowledge gaps?
Yeah, so I think the key thing, if you want your project or thesis to be more than just, you know, for research or publication purposes, is you need to get involved with you know, a company in the industry who's either producing a product or is you know, very involved in it, such as you know, the review agencies that are developing criteria for engineers and designers. One particular gap I think that we're missing in technologies is for phosphorus removal. So right now, this is kind of a big deal in the Lake Simcoe region in Ontario, where they have you know, historic phosphorus removal issues, but there's no real good solutions for phosphorus removal other than the jellyfish filter. Thanks to Steve for developing that, as well as some underground infiltration technologies. And if you've got high groundwater, then you're going to have issues infiltrating. So you know, there's very limited alternatives in that area. If someone were to, you know, conduct research showing an at surface, maybe different types of plants that excel at phosphorus uptake, I think it would have, you know, probably a pretty significant impact on the land development industry, just to have, you know, some other alternative technologies to look to.
Thanks, Nick. So our next question comes from Samantha, and this one's directed to Sheila. So what do you think about the future of green infrastructure policies in North America? So I think if you sort of were to imagine, you know, what's going to be happening policy-wise at not just maybe a Canadian level, but at a, you know, continent level, what are the directions that you sort of see for green infrastructure policy, public policy?
Well, I think that there's a growing understanding that this is tied to climate change and resilience, and governments globally are looking more closely at nature-based solutions for urban heat island mitigation. While we don't have like a national policy, we have a lot of good policies. We have policies around green infrastructure in Ontario that municipalities need to integrate green infrastructure. They need to look for opportunities. It could be stronger language. They should be required to look for opportunity, or required to do it. I think our language is too weak, and I think that will change, but we're kind of, I think, slowly conservative with changing in our policies here. But I know there is effort at the national level to look at the language we use, because one of the problems is we're all talking different kinds of dialects when it comes to green infrastructure, even in Canada. So there's work being done by the Council for the Environmental Commissioners or something, CCME. I always forget the Canadian Council for the Ministers of the Environment. They're doing a natural infrastructure terminology framework project, which is basically a library of these terms that we've been using across Canada, because until there's an understanding of what you're talking about, it's really hard to get it into some kind of policy that's legally, you know, can be approved and so on. So I think the future is you're going to see more of it. You're going to see stronger language, and yeah, I think it's not going away. We may keep changing the names, so we need to stop. That's just in nature.
Yeah, it's every few years, every 5 years, there's a name change and a rebranding.
Well, and even using the word low impact development, that's an engineering term that you say that to people, you're going to turn some people off. And we talk about pre-settlement versus pre-development, because a farm has been developed, right? And you have a farm that's tile drained and all of the water is gone, and somehow we're protecting headwaters that have been completely, and you know, drained. So there is no hydrology happening. So how do we go back to pre-settlement, or look at farming in a way that Arlene was talking about, was the, you know, ecosystem services from the big picture, not just one silo of one thing, right?
Yeah, very true. So our next panelist, so I didn't have enough time to type this in to figure out who's going to speak to us first, but Garland has sort of asked for any of the panelists, could you describe in brief a project where you collaborated with an ecologist? I think that's a really good profession to be highlighted that we're actually missing today. So who would like to or who has an example of work where they've actually worked with an ecologist? Nick.
Yeah, ecology is incredibly important in the land development industry. We are constantly collaborating with ecologists for establishing, you know, our limits of development. You know, they're constantly surveying for endangered species. There's a lot of different criteria throughout Ontario that affects, you know, where we can develop, you know, when we can take down trees. You know, where there are significant water courses in the area that need protection through the construction stage as well as through post-construction. So they form, you know, an integral part of every single development team, and are essential as part of the development process.
Thanks for that. So one of the questions I want to make sure that we don't forget that I actually received ahead of time today came from Taylor, and she wanted to know what panelists would say was their most challenging obstacle in obtaining a career in living infrastructure. Who would like to talk to this one? I'm going to pick someone at random. How about Mark?
It's a good question. I think generally one of the biggest challenges for a career in living infrastructure is that the types of technology, you have to have a passion for it, and you have to drive, because it is inherently progressive in nature and is typically pushing on what existing city standards and practices are, right? So, you know, the whole concept behind LID and living infrastructure and green infrastructure is to look for ways that the way our city systems, urban systems work can provide better outcomes, and that usually requires kind of rethinking how the systems function and work, and not just defaulting to, you know, a design manual that you're given to and designing the next, you know, repetitive set of infrastructure per old standards. So, you know, I would say it's very easy to find yourself in a position where you don't have the opportunity to innovate and push those limits, which is fundamental to pursuing a career in these types of technologies. So I would say, you know, if you're passionate about it, as you enter the career field, make sure you're seeking out opportunities with companies who, you know, maybe give you the 1% time where you can, you know, they encourage you to explore your own ideas or initiatives with a portion of your work, and just make sure that they have a broader mission and an alignment with the types of work that you want to do.
Thanks. Steve, what about you? You know, you talked a lot about how you've gone through many stages in your career trying to balance just keeping the lights on and also and pursuing work that you're passionate and find meaningful as well. So, you know, what are your thoughts in terms of our obstacles in pursuing careers in living infrastructure? Yeah,
thanks, Jen. I would say there, you know, from my CB Shield point of view, one of the biggest obstacles, and of kind of echo what Mark was just talking about, are really the maintenance departments that are very set in their ways about doing certain things, and engineering departments that are very set in their ways, because those ways work, quite frankly. You know, we can knock that kind of attitude, but at the same time, it's keeping us all, it's keeping things running pretty well. And that has always been the biggest challenge in my career, including with living infrastructure, is showing people that it can work, and showing people that it is a good alternative to a harder approach. And I think we still have a lot of work to do there. And I know I'm going to end my career still trying to show people that this is a good way to do things. I think a lot of things have really changed in 30 years, let me tell you, but we're still not there.
Thanks. There's another question here I haven't published, but from Sylvie, and just was wondering if you could give a little bit more information about how you created and developed your startup. I know it's a very different idea. You don't often hear civil engineers being entrepreneurs. You know, I think you think of that with more of like someone developing an app or whatever, but yeah, could you kind of just give us a little bit more information about how you created CB Shield?
Yeah, sure. It's kind of an interesting story, sure. And you know, Nick was talking about phosphorus problems in Lake Simcoe. And, you know, a lot of phosphorus is adhered to sediment particles and fine sediment. So we were thinking, I had met a fellow who had an idea. And this idea was to turn every catch basin in every city into a little mini treatment system. And it's I thought it was a great idea because, you know, people don't know this, but there's a catch basin in Canada for about every 15 people. I mean, there are a lot of catch basins in urban drainage systems in Canada. And we can talk about designing things for new infrastructure, but we only build about 1% a year on a new infrastructure, you know, and I think we've solved some of those things. But what about all this existing urban stuff that's sitting there? So this fellow came to me with an idea, and I ended up creating a partnership with him. We were literally, I think, out for dinner, and he sketched something on a napkin. He says, "I've been thinking about this." And I said, "You know, that's a pretty good idea." And we checked through my work with its Imbrium Systems. I was working with as their engineering director. I did get familiar with how to patent things and how to do testing in labs. So we checked to see if this thing had been patented. It hadn't been. main ideas, worked in a lab to see if it would work, and it does, and it was patentable, and that's really how we started. We gathered around a device. We were pretty sure there was a need for it. And, you know, I would caution people to do a startup, because my other startup, which I mentioned, I think there's a need for it, but right now it's just too complex and too, the market wasn't there for it. And it's a very risky thing to put all your time and money into something without knowing that there's a market for it. So it's kind of a guess, and it's not for everybody, but doing a startup is a lot of fun, I have to say.
Thanks. So another question that I want to make sure that we cover today that was submitted ahead of time from a postdoc of ours, Halim. You know, this is an unprecedented moment in time. You know, myself, I'm preparing to deliver an entire semester online. You know, no in-person teaching at all in our fall semester. And for our graduates, recent graduates, or upcoming graduates, it's a very uncertain time to be entering the job force. As Mark mentioned, you know, recessions come and go. They can be great motivators for changing career paths or continuing on with school, but sometimes, you know, the time to find your job is now. So for our audience today, what words of advice and strategies would you suggest to help, you know, job seekers, you know, particularly interested in entering into the living infrastructure? Do you think it is a good time to enter the job market? And if you are trying to get that entry-level job, what advice would you give to our audience? I'm going to start with Nick, since you're the most. I mean, you've been working for 5 years. You're not really you're intermediate, but it's in most recent memory. And then I'll ask a few other panelists as well. Yeah,
it's definitely unprecedented as far as, you know, a recession goes, or at least, you know, for the last century, unprecedented. I know at our company, you know, we've had to put hiring of like even summer students on hold temporarily, just because everyone's kind of reeling from the effects of having to completely switch to remote working. And the biggest issue that we've had is how do you properly train someone using remote communication? You know, usually you're there in person, you can draw sketches, you can kind of walk them through what you're doing by inviting them over to your computer. You know, it's very informal, and there's a constant stream of communication to try and get that person up to speed, and you know, utilize their skills. So, you know, how to overcome that is difficult to say. Obviously, it's going to be based on how each individual company handles it. But I think the key is demonstrating that you're able to communicate visually through the use of you know, basic and widely available tools. You know, it sounds a bit funny, but right now my company communicates visually through the use of PDF editors. You know, we'll draw notes on drawings or figures that we circulate to our teams. You know, in meetings, we'll just kind of sketch up little lines on whatever happens to be on the screen at the time. And that's kind of how we've handled it. You know, being familiar with standard meeting software, again, it's basic, but, you know, adding it onto your resume, you're familiar with Zoom, all the features of it, Skype, Microsoft Teams. You know, they weren't essential skills before, but now they definitely are. And I guess demonstrating a willingness to self-learn, because a lot of your time, you know, when you do get hired, you know, your supervisor might not be able to get to you to help with your training. You know, being familiar with standard industry criteria documents, just having that base knowledge available for someone to utilize, I think is going to kind of make you stand out a bit. Thanks, Nick. Arlene, you talked a lot about how
you've had to lean in and create your own job or fundraise for your own job in your own experience. So what words of advice would you give for students right now, looking to enter into the job sector?
Well, I would say, all of the staff at Ryerson Urban Farm started out as volunteers or students or participants of a program, and at the Urban Farm. So, and we offer lots of different opportunities to get involved, and people will say, what are the chances of getting a job out of this? And from my experience, it can feel like there's so much competition, and you're doing these internships and volunteering, and it feels impossible. But actually, it does often lead to something meaningful, and not to be afraid to believe in yourself and say, I'm gonna put myself out there. I'm gonna do this internship. I'm gonna make connections and develop skills and relationships. Because in my experience, it did lead to work, even though I really thought about quitting along the way. I felt like I'd invested enough time that I should just keep going. So I can relate to how difficult it can feel when you're looking for a job. There's a quote from Dr. Phil that says, "Looking for a job is a full-time job." But, and then the reward of getting a job is now you have to go to work every day. And then where does time go? But yeah, it is a tricky thing. But yeah, I would say, I had a dream when I was young to be an urban farmer, which when I grew older, I felt like that was a very immature and reckless choice, but it actually worked out. So I would say, don't give up on your dreams. That's a very, I guess, cheesy answer, but I had to say it.
I think you do raise a good point, though. It's an insane moment in time, but life is always insane. And if it wasn't a global pandemic, it would be something else. I think I'd also, before we move on to sort of our last topic for the day, or question for the day, Mark, what advice would you give, for graduates, looking to enter the job market at the moment?
Yeah, it's certainly a challenging time, and I think most companies right now are taking a pause and really reassessing what the future is going to look like coming out of the pandemic and when it will come out. I think there's still uncertainty of how long the work from home is going to last, and is this actually the new normal indefinitely, or is there going to be some semblance of returning back to pre-COVID in 6 months, 12 months, 18 months, right? So it is certainly a challenging time. What I would say is that a lot of cities and developers who take the long-term view will invest heavily on project planning and approvals work right now. And so I think being strategic and understanding where the market is spending money on what stages of the project, and also looking for, publicly funded projects that typically have higher investment in times of recession and downturn could be some advice just where you're looking at. I think, throughout the course of the summer, if you can find a company or a project that is more forward looking and has a really, defined analysis on what the market is going to do and where they're investing dollars, that there is work out there, and it could be a really interesting time to get involved in kind of the early end pre-planning approvals stages of projects. But I think it will be a long time before you see a lot of capital flowing back into big, large-scale infrastructure projects.
Yeah.
If I could add one.
Yes, please, of course, Sheila.
Oh, I was just going to comment. I think we are going to see big money flowing towards green infrastructure. There's a lot of stimulus funding that's going to be happening. So I think for students at this point, I think like us as professionals, I mean, I'm in transition right now because of COVID. Our job market has been way too slow. But I think what I would give as advice is diversify, right? Find things that you can do that are, you can work in different, you can go in different career paths at the same time. You can be an entrepreneurial innovator while you're working a desk job, while you're teaching, while you're writing. I don't understand why we have to think you can only do one thing. And there's so much out there that is actually free resources. Like Ryerson has a social venture zone. So last summer I took courses on creating a social venture, and that's something I'm working on at the side as a passion project. So networking, relationship building, I think that's harder right now, but it's just a new way. I don't think it's forever. People are social distancing and meeting more in person. That might be for a very long time, but I think you got to get out there and network and find a way while you increase your knowledge about the subject you're most passionate about, because that's going to ground you. You need to know something well, I think, and then you'll find your path.
Thank you. Arlene, do you want to add a few comments?
Yeah, just I wanted to add some of the experience I had in fundraising. I took a workshop many years ago when I was at Concordia that it was a 2-day workshop, but the theme was, the message was very specific, which was to know your mission. And if you have a very clear goal and mission, and you're asking for a very specific number of, like, you really identify what you're asking for in terms of funding and what you're going to do. And you, that, like, being able to really express what your plan is very cohesively, that, like, that's the first step. So it's not to get the money first and then have a plan, it's to have a plan and the money will follow. And I think that that's really been true in my experience. And I think that it does apply to job hunting as well, because you know, you have to really have a defined goal and a work back plan that's clear. And in my own career path, you know, when I look back, it was over 10 years, but I had a defined goal in mind. So I think really knowing what you're looking for specifically, both in job searching and in fundraising, is important.
Okay, thank you. So that brings us to almost the end of our time today. So I'd like to just close by thanking our panelists, Steve, Sheila, Arlene, Mark, Nick. Thank you so much for taking your time today. It's been so interesting to hear your different perspectives and the breadth of your experiences. I'm sure this has been really interesting and engaging for our audience. I wanted to remind everyone that this is episode 1 of 4. So I would invite everyone to join us again next week. We are going to have 2 professors speaking who are a part of the CREATE network. Darko is a professor at Ryerson University, and he'll be speaking about integrating living infrastructure and the Internet of Things. And then Jeff is a professor at the University of Saskatchewan, and he'll be talking about lifting the lid, if you will, on hydrologic processes. So using stable isotopes to trace runoff and plant water on natural and artificial slopes. So I think this will be a great opportunity to see some of the very exciting research that is taking place at some of our universities and our members. And then we'll also make sure we have time to have a conversation and a discussion as well with these 2 professors to get some more academic perspectives. So I'd like to close by also reminding everyone that if you want to come back to this, we will be posting this session online. If there's something that was really interested and you want to share to anyone who wasn't able to join us live today, it will be posted online, and you can check out our website. And we'll also be circulating a survey just to get response and feedback about what you thought about the format for today's session. As I said, this is our first time doing a webinar. Whether or not you liked the MS Live system as a system of choice, ideas and thoughts that you might have, because one of the real advantages of doing this is we actually have audience members, across the country and actually in different countries right now, which is amazing to be able to have that kind of reach. And so I think, well, this is something that the program will keep, because it really is a unique opportunity for connecting with people. So we really, really would appreciate your feedback on what you thought of today and what you think might work or ideas that you might have. So that brings us to the end. Again, thank you all so much, both to our speakers and to our audience members, for your excellent questions. And hopefully we'll see you all again next week. Okay, thank you, and enjoy the rest of your Friday.